Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one it is yet another day where the only developments are within the Kurakhove and Velyka Novosilka directions. Again, heavy fighting continues all across the front line. I'll specify further later, but the most decisive battles that are taking place with outcomes is happening in the Kurakhove direction. Starting out in the direction of Velyka Novosilka, the Russians started yesterday with a new offensive towards Velyka Novosilka, storming it directly as well as advancing towards Rostolne in the north and generally advancing in the area of Velyka Novosilka from the eastern direction. The Russians have made several advances in this direction, capturing approximately 30 square kilometers in the direction of Velyka Novosilka. These advances are mainly centered around the fortified positions of the Ukrainians near Velyka Novosilka and the ones in the direction of Rostolne, while there's also a significant push by the Russians from the direction of Novodonetsk and Zolotoneva along the main highway. What we're seeing here in the direction of Velyka Novosilka is Russians are advancing along the first lines, dropping off infantry as far as the armored vehicles can go, before they storm the fortified positions with armored vehicles and dropping off infantry. The Russians are moving step by step through these fortified positions to reach the outskirts of the next defensive line, while consolidating the gains they made in the former. An example of which would be the Russians have control over these fortified positions. They then make an armored assault towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in the next line, which is the one located right next to it. The way these armored assaults work is that the Russians launch a large artillery strike on the Ukrainian positions. This is to suppress the Ukrainian defensive forces within these fortified positions. At the same time as that happens, the Russians then drive up with armored vehicles and infantry that then drive up to these positions. While the vehicles suppress the Ukrainian positions, the Russian infantry disembark and then storm these fortified positions, capturing Ukrainian soldiers and capturing the positions. And that is how they continue step by step, offensive after offensive. What we likely saw is that we see there's this road here in the northern direction, then there's fortified positions along the forest lines, which are simply trenches located within these forest lines. The Russians then drive past them, flank their positions, while all of these fortified positions are under heavy artillery fire, to then drop off infantry in the rear. With the infantry in the rear, they storm the first fortified positions head on and capture them bit by bit from both directions. This is what is possible due to the Russian control over some of these fortified positions. But at the same time, the Russians also attacked in the northern direction to redirect the fire from the fortified positions in the northern direction, likely also in an attempt to gain control over those. But they did not succeed with those. They instead succeeded with the ones in the southern direction, where we also see that there is additional fortified positions that were also captured south of these, with likely a large assault by the Russians on a wide front, attacking both the ones in the north, in the south, and further north, all at the same time. Further north, the Russians also captured the one near Shakhtarsk, and are moving on to the next one. Exactly as I previously mentioned, the Russians capture fortified position and establish positions ahead of the next one before they storm that as well. With the Russian advance north of this fortified position, it is likely that the Russians are looking to flank these fortified positions. Therefore, the Russians will also flank the next fortified position from the north or from the south, following the capture of this one, gaining control over these two fortified positions will allow the Russians to be able to storm Rostolne here in the north, following which the Russians will fight over the fortified positions located within the road itself, and will be able to flank the fortified positions further south, either from the southern direction or from the northern direction. In general, the Russians are here storming the forest lines bit by bit, fortified positions bit by bit, getting closer and closer to Velyka Novosilka, where the Russians are now at the outskirts of the settlement, fighting over the final defensive fortified positions of the Ukrainians ahead of Velyka Novosilka, after which the Russians can storm the settlement itself. Moving further north, we see to the north of Kharkov in the northern flank on the wider area, the Russians have advanced and captured the fortified positions of the Ukrainians northeast of Berezhsky. With this, it is the final fortified position that they are fighting over before the Russians can advance and connect the settlement of Novosilka with Berezhsky and allow the Russians to then continue pushing along the Kharkov Reservoir here to the north of Kharkov. Further north, the Russians are also advancing towards Pustinka from the north, and they've managed to advance north of Selidove. The Russians are pressuring Pustinka from the northern, eastern, and southern directions, attacking it from 3 separate directions, where they are fighting Ukrainian elite units that have established their positions here west of Selidove, preventing a Russian breakthrough towards Pokrovsk to delay the battle of that city, be delayed as much as possible. While in the northern direction, the Russians are also fighting off against the elite Ukrainian forces south of Pokrovsk. The objective of the Russians is to continue and expand their foothold near Lysivka, fighting over the fortified positions north of Novosilka, and push towards Dashensky from the south to have control over the E50 highway between Selidove and Pokrovsk. So these conclude the advances that have happened over the past 24 hours. A very important note that I want to specify in this video and explain is that although these are the areas where territorial changes have happened, does not mean that these are the only areas where fighting is taking place. It simply means that these are the areas where over the past 24 hours, the ones attacking were successful and managed to not only neutralize the defensive forces, but also to capture their territory. And if we take a look at the front line, where exactly is fighting taking place right now? There is fighting taking place in the Zaporizhia section of the front line, where the Russians are on the offensive towards Melatukmashka and Novodanilivka. While at the same time, we also have to understand that an offensive is not just constant human wave tactics, especially not as the quote-unquote experts want to make you believe. Instead, it is an advance after which the forces consolidate their gains. A new attack force or storming force is replacing the old one in a rotation where the forward units are replaced with defensive units, after which new forward units are sent forward to launch a new attack. Therefore, sometimes it is not on a day-to-day basis offensive operations take place, depending on the intensity of the artillery taking place, FPV drones, coverage, and so much more. It can take several days between assaults, but in general, offensive operations are taking place here in the Zaporizhia direction, with heavy fighting between the two sides. Similarly, in the Huliaipole direction, there's some fighting taking place, but there's no active storming of the city taking place. Further north, in the direction of Velyka and Novosilka, here there are more active operations where the Russians are fighting on over the Rivka and Rivnopil. This is in the operational positional fighting stage, where the Russians are slowly rotating out forces. They captured some territory. Now they are rotating defensive forces, after which they'll send in a new stormtrooper force to take control over Novosilka, consolidate that, and then push onwards. So these areas, there are more gaps between the offensive operations, while in the eastern direction, there's a much larger force fighting, and this is why there can be constant advances by the Russians, as these larger forces are able to fight for longer and on a wider area, which then allows for more advances at a faster pace. In the direction of the river line, there's heavy fighting taking place on both flanks, both from the northern direction through Dalnie, from the southern direction through Maximivka and Bohoyavlenka, and from the eastern direction towards Ilinka and Yelisavetivka. So we see heavy fighting there as well. Similarly, in Kharkov, to the northern direction, and in general this whole area, there's constantly these rotations taking place. It's also a very prioritized section of the front line, so there are more units that can be used and rotated in and out through the fighting taking place. There's not much fighting taking place here to the north of Avdiivka. It is not a prioritized section of the front line. It is mostly positional with some artillery. If there's an opportunity, they'll exploit it. Other than that, they simply stay on the defensive. In the Toretsk and New York directions, the Russians and the Ukrainians are constantly on the offensive here, where whenever a small gap in the defenses appear, they exploit it and take advantage of it, launching an offensive operations to gain control over the areas. And this makes this section of the front line very dynamic. We see that with the advances by both sides taking place regularly through this month, which has allowed for several Russian and Ukrainian advances. Further north, we see positional fighting along Chasiv Yar. Yet again, this is a very hotly contested section of the front line. The Ukrainians counterattacked near Stupushki and to the southern flank of Chasiv Yar. This allowed the Russians to capture positions along the canal west of Klishivka, securing their flank. And now the area near the southern flank of Chasiv Yar is more balanced. The Russians will prevent any Ukrainian further counterattacks to regain the entire canal line, while the Russians will attempt to, at the same time, expand the zone of control. Similarly, the Ukrainians will look to regain control over the canal and prevent the Russians from taking any further advances in the southern flank of Chasiv Yar. Within the city itself, the Russians are storming the industrial zone. This means that there's very heavy fighting that we'll not know the outcome of until the battle is completely over, and this can take days or even weeks, considering there's a large underground area as well. Also the apartment complex area, and this section of the front line is not very talkative about the advances. It's really all geolocations that allow us to determine where the front line is. In the northern flank, there's similar, just a lot of positional fighting. The Russians are attempting to gain control of the fortified positions, storming the Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainians are attempting to exploit any gaps in the Russian positions. In the Siversk direction, it is very different because there it is simply more risky for the Russian side. They tend to make operations that are not as determined as other areas, and they tend to leave gaps in the defenses as well. This has allowed the Russians to capture some positions at a fast pace, but it also means that the Ukrainians tend to recapture it fairly quickly as the Russians are out of balance and aren't properly consolidating their positions fast enough to prevent a Ukrainian counterattack, or maybe simply be in line with the Ukrainian tactics in the area to be able to leave some gaps, allowing the Russians to exploit what to just be a trap and the Ukrainians then counterattack. In the Liman-Kreminna section near the Serbets river line, it is yet again a different sort of fighting taking place here. Here it is very difficult to settle at any of these positions. They're difficult to consolidate your positions, very difficult to defend these positions because most of it is simply open fields. Supplies, reinforcements, all of it are exposed when they are on the move. This makes it very difficult for either side to concentrate forces anywhere, and this makes it very difficult for the Russians to advance and the Ukrainians to counterattack. Instead, what we mostly see is that the Russians simply do some very small sized pushes where they do some positional fighting. The Ukrainians hold them back with FPV drones, sometimes do a counterattack, and the Russians simply do these slow advances trying to capture fortified positions. So we see this small advance here took place over 3 different days, 3 different operations that allowed the Russians to capture this part. Here it is 5 different pushes to gain control over this small bit, and this shows exactly how heavy fighting there is taking place over this direction, yet there's so small results. That's due to a large concentration of FPV drones and artillery, yet not a lot of infantry or armored vehicles are allowed to be sent to the front line to capture territory. In the northern direction, there's a similar amount of fighting. It's just a much wider area where fighting is taking place, where the Russians are really just trying to take advantage of any exploits or gaps in the Ukrainian defenses. Like the Kupiansk direction, there was simply a gap in the Ukrainian defenses. The Russians took advantage of it, which allowed them to capture and get a foothold within the eastern parts of Kupiansk to then fight over the industrial area, which is heavily taking place across the section of the front line. In the Kharkiv direction, the Ukrainians are attempting to recapture it. The Russians have established fortified positions and are completely on the defensive. Sometimes there's a bit of back and forth near the aggregate plant in the Vovchansk itself, but other than that, it is completely the Ukrainians on the offensive. The Russians are simply trying to hold on to their foothold in the Kharkiv direction. In the Kursk direction, it is the opposite. The Russians are on the offensive. The Ukrainians are just trying to hold on to their positions as much as possible. This is to prevent the Russians from redirecting their forces here to the southern front or eastern front and prevent them from launching an operation inside of Ukraine. The nature of the fighting here is similar to the Oskar River line and the Serbis River line, where there's a lot of open areas. It's very difficult to resupply or move large amounts of forces. So instead, it is a very high-paced offensive operation sort of situation where either side attempts to concentrate some forces and gain significant success. If that fails, then they'll have to wait until the next time they can concentrate forces. If it succeeds, they'll capture a significant amount of territory, because that is simply the nature of the geography of the fighting in the Kursk region. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out our Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.